Anytime we talk about the traditional wisdom or traditional religion or the traditional doctrine, not to mention other terms used by some writers like Sophia perennis or perennialism, the first question that comes up for new readers or in conversation with people that may not be familiar with these writers is, what is the term tradition? What does that mean exactly? Because everyone has heard the word, but in common usage, it's something more like habit or an arbitrarily repeated action or ritual or something along those lines. It implies repetition, usually meaningless repetition. It even has a pejorative meaning attached to it for the most part. Traditions are bad. Traditions are mindless. Traditions are the very things that it is up to progress to overcome and replace. So that's the common modern usage. There's also the Catholic usage, which is much more similar to what we're using here in the manual in my work. But also in the other, I suppose, traditionalist writers like Rene Guenon, Frithjof Schuon, Titus Burckhardt, Ananda Coomaraswamy. If you've read their work, then this video might be superfluous to you. But especially if you are a Catholic, then you would already be familiar with the term tradition, and there's a lot of overlap. But because we're addressing ourselves to the larger religious world, the history of the world from the point of view of the great religions, then we're not necessarily dealing with the strict, very precise meaning given to tradition in Catholicism for doctrinal and teaching purposes, but very, very, very similar. So basically the term tradition etymologically just means that which is transmitted, that which is handed down. So for myself, for the traditionalist writers, tradition refers to the content of a revelation, not just in its earthly situation, but all throughout history. It's historical elaboration. So from this point of view, tradition is almost synonymous with doctrine, but it's also more, since it encompasses the doctrine established at its point of origin as well as its authentic development throughout history. So when we refer to the Christian tradition, we have in mind the doctrine bequeathed to the disciples directly by Christ, which would be oral transmission. That's one of the two means of transmission. But also we include scriptures established at a later date and time and gradually. And this would be written transmission. So we have oral and written transmission. And we also have the meaning of the term tradition accompanies or encompasses the dogmatic formulations proposed by the magisterium at any point in its history, and now until the end of the world, which again goes back to that tradition, including the founding and the historical unfolding of a doctrine. So tradition is a living doctrine, the life of which can be traced from the planting of the seed through its entire development. So from here, we might ask if all religions are not traditional. And the answer is yes, insofar as they are intact and healthy and alive, then yes. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, those are all in principle traditional religions with some sense of continuity and wholeness, unity. Yet the situation is more complex because in all cases, in all traditions, there are revolutions, innovations occur, and that will often result in the formation of a new branch. That new branch might remain fully connected to the original vine, to use the Christian symbolism, and so remain traditional, representing a valid expression of the possibilities contained in the original doctrine. Or, on the other hand, the new outgrowth might intentionally or unintentionally separate itself completely from the established religion, at which point it might retain the name, but having reinvented or reinterpreted the doctrine, or usually introducing novelties into it that can't be reconciled with its historical truth, it can no longer be called traditional, since it has departed from the authentic line of transmission. And this is why in traditional religions you will usually find some emphasis on lines of transmission. For Catholicism, that's apostolic succession, which establishes the, credentials, the genealogy of the priesthood, which is, in Catholicism, responsible for the maintenance and dissemination of the revelation, the content of the revelation, and its development. So, speaking of Christianity specifically, we do have examples readily available of both types of branches, legitimate and illegitimate. The first legitimate branching out would be the disagreement that resulted in the Great Schism of the 11th century, dividing the Eastern Orthodox from the Roman Catholic. So that wasn't deep enough to render either party unorthodox in the sense that there is no communion between them. And that's why there is an acknowledged communion between them, an acknowledged respect and legitimacy, even if they're not quite always seeing things eye to eye, and although there is definite division. Now, the Protestant Reformation, which came centuries later, that was a very different case. It represents the second possibility. It was the product of a reforming impulse that was, in some sense, legitimate. It's always legitimate to want to eradicate abuses, but ultimately it was destructive because it was revolutionary. It was more of a revolution than a reformation. Or it may have started as an impulse to reform and became a very, very leveling, destructive, revolutionary phenomena. So the Reformation produced a fragmented collection of new churches. Each had their own doctrinal innovations without really, being concerned with reconciling them with one another. Resulted in a lot of contradictions, disagreements, perpetual splintering. Now, throughout most of the history of Protestantism, or if that term is negative, we could say non-Catholic Christianity. It's unified mostly by a sentiment, not so much a doctrine. A sentiment that we could define as anti-traditional, which amounts to being anti-Catholic. And I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that. And for the most part, I think we're just taking the representatives of Protestantism at their word, since Protestant writers, as a general rule, explicitly condemn tradition. I've attended non-Catholic evangelical services enough to know that one of the, perpetually present themes in the sermons is a distaste for tradition and warnings about tradition. And so that term for non-Catholic Christians tends to have a meaning that is very, very different from the Catholic usage. And as opposed or placed in opposition to tradition, what is always emphasized is Scripture alone. So after the Reformation, sola scriptura is adopted as the single guide to truth, and Scripture is then used as a foil to discredit any theology that can't be easily proof-texted. From the traditional point of view, the doctrine of sola scriptura amounts to sawing off the branch that you're sitting on, because without the living components of a traditional framework, such as the teaching authority that is the magisterium for Catholics, Scripture becomes a mirror reflecting the best and the worst of any well-intentioned interpreter's imagination. It becomes heavily influenced by the incompetence of individuals, which, like most of us, who do not have the linguistic knowledge or adequate theological preparation or experience or just sheer time required to understand Scripture. And the individual then finds himself adrift in a sea of words taken from a language he does not speak, from a time he does not know, and that speak to him of ideas he is almost certainly not equipped to untangle. So we'll address the issue of oral and written transmission separately as two means of propagating a doctrine, a revelation. But here we'll just say that for a traditionalist, Scripture is tradition. It is an aspect of tradition. It's one of its modes, a product of that tradition, and the property of that tradition. It's as valid as any other part of that tradition, but it's never absolutized. In Catholicism, there is no, bibolatry. It's naturally excluded. So, to return to the main point, when we reference tradition here, and when the quote traditionalists are talking about tradition, we're not dealing with theories, historical inventions, preferences, routines, repetitions, cultural idiosyncrasies. It's directly referring to a doctrinal content, a body of transcendent knowledge preserved in an earthly situation. So, and sort of given expression through the religions. When we refer to a traditional civilization, what we mean is any civilization that is animated by a revealed doctrine so thoroughly that the institutions, arts, economic life, daily life of that civilization revolve around that transcendent center. And that center acts as the principle that guides and informs every peripheral activity, however worldly. So one of the symbols used to show this is a giant wheel, and the doctrine, the tradition, sits at the center, the unmoved mover, so to speak. And as you continue out in concentric circles connected by the spokes of that wheel, sort of another symbol would be the sun at the center, and the rays of the sun move outward to the outermost circumference of that wheel, of that social world. And so that social life at every level is baptized, connected, becomes a kind of spiritual unity, and every task becomes a kind of ritual or prayer of religious participation in the tradition. Social life itself becomes a means of spiritual development. Now, it should be obvious, having said that, why in traditional civilizations the established religion always sits at the top of the social hierarchy. That's not some kind of manipulative tyranny. It's logical and, in fact, necessary, since it is the role of the religious authority to maintain, develop, and diffuse the principial knowledge throughout society that is contained in the revelation. So thought must precede action, knowledge before action, and so the caste that is responsible for the discernment of knowledge in its most principial form must be at the top.